Today, October 17th, 2024. Well, not today, this evening at 6 p.m. Central Time. Wherever you are in this country, I want you to think about Robert Roberson. He is scheduled to be executed in Huntsville, Texas at that time. Why? Stay tuned. I'm going to tell you all about it. Get your coffee for this one. It's a doozy. Yes. I've got my snow days coffee cup. It's not snowing, obviously, but it's winter. Winter has come to my house. Finally, this 90 to 100 degrees is over with until next year. Why are we here today? I'm going to talk to you about a 58-year-old Robert Roberson. He is a gentleman that is sitting on death row in the state of Texas, in Huntsville. He was convicted in 2003 of murdering his daughter on January 31st, 2002. Now, his daughter was 2.5 years old at the time, and I have not heard hide nor hair about where this mother is or what happened to the mother. But that night, he wakes up during the night. She has fallen out of her crib. He puts her back in the crib. She doesn't appear, injured in any way. And, that happens. So he puts her back in the crib. She goes back to sleep. When he wakes up in the morning, she's not breathing, and he rushes her to the emergency room in a little town called Palestine in Texas. And at Palestine Regional Medical Center, they are trying desperately to save this child's life. They immediately put her on life support. They intubate her, which is a tube that goes down through your trachea into your lungs that provides you with oxygen to the brain. And they get her stabilized on life support, and then they transfer her to a trauma hospital. And that was the name of the hospital that they transferred her to was Children's Medical, a children's hospital. But she passes away the next day. Meanwhile, back at the Palestine Regional Medical Center, they call the Palestine Police Department. Now, out comes Detective Brian Wharton. He is chief of the detectives. Now, he appeared yesterday before the Committee of Criminal Jurisprudence, which is a committee that the legislature of Texas put together to, honestly, I don't know what the purpose of this committee is, but what they did was they had a 4-hour hearing yesterday, and I listened to it. And at this hearing, they were hearing testimony with respect to this case, and seemed very inclined, leaning towards, this guy should not be put to death. No. As all the witnesses were leaning towards that as well. When this hearing ended, their course of action was to issue a subpoena to Robert Roberson to come testify before them next week. Now, he's scheduled to die today. I think their thought process is this will delay that. I don't think so. The only thing that's going to stop this execution tonight is the governor has to step in or the Supreme Court of the United States. And don't think that won't happen. It could happen between now. They've got 6 hours. I don't know when you're listening to this. It may have already happened. But let me tell you what this detective Brian Wharton had to say. He's now retired, but he was a military police officer. When he got done serving in the military, he took a job at Palestine Police Department. He became chief of the detectives in 2002. He responded out to the hospital. They, at their behest, he comes out and he can visually see that they are scrambling to try to save this child's life. Now, he observes the child and he sees no trauma on this child. And the nurse is like, yeah, she's got a bump on the back of her head. Let me shave her head. Let me show you. And there's a small bump there. He said she looked like she had some small bruising on her chin, just some small bruising areas. Nothing else. Nothing else. So someone, and he does not remember who, he said it could have been a nurse. Someone mentions shaken baby syndrome, and the medical profession just runs with it. From then on, the doctors were saying, yep, this is shaken baby syndrome. The nurses were saying it. Now the police are relying on that. Police can only rely on what they are told by the medical professionals. They go on to do an autopsy. The medical examiner latches onto it. Yep, shaken baby syndrome. There you have it. That's the prosecution's case sewn up in a nutshell, because at the time, shaken baby syndrome was a triad. Well, it's still a triad, but there's no such thing as shaken baby syndrome anymore. They have renamed it. It's now called, it has a fancy name. It is now called, where did I write it down? Abusive head trauma. But it has to be the triad accompanied by some other trauma or something to explain what's going on here. The injuries in this triad are swelling of the brain, bleeding behind the eyes, and I'm simplifying this for you guys, and a subdural hematoma. Now, if you find in the day back in 2002 when they found those findings, the presumption was whoever the last person was with that child is the perpetrator, that they had to have shaken that child with enough force to cause the injury, which would give you your intent, so to speak, um, that's necessary to convict someone of a crime. And I mean, so the prosecutors basically just said, oh, shaken baby syndrome. Yep. But since 2002, the medical profession has changed the way they think about shaken baby syndrome, and we'll get to that. Let's continue with the testimony of Brian Wharton, the chief detective. He, the child's name was Nikki, 2.5 years old, Nikki. He, after being summoned to the hospital, he gets the father aside and he interviews the father. And he said his affect was very strange. Now, we know now that he had undiagnosed autism. He didn't know he was autistic. No one else knew that he was autistic. Because at that time, it really wasn't as well publicized as autism is now, and as well as mainstream as it is. And yes, autistic people can father children and they can raise children and they can be normal parents. But they're going to have a different affect, and which is what this guy was seeing. He said it was just really strange what I was seeing. He was responsive to questions, but usually when somebody's being really, really defensive, they're nervous. He didn't see that. Or they just the opposite. They're so sure of themselves. They're like overconfident. Oh, I didn't do that. He wasn't seeing any of these extremes of emotion with this guy. Just sort of a flat affect. He took the father to his home. The father said, come on in, gave him a tour of the house. He said, it wasn't magazine ready, but, normal house with a normal amount of clutter, like maybe not as much clutter as you see at my house, but anyway, nothing untoward when he got this little tour of the house. He saw the crib that she supposedly fell out of. So they took pictures on this little house tour. They took evidence. They took the bed sheets, some other stuff for DNA. But he said there was no signs of any violence in that house. None. So he goes to trial and he explains to this committee, when I went to trial, I was under the rule. Now, whenever I'm covering trials, sometimes I fail to mention this because it's such a routine thing that it really goes unnoticed most times. But if an attorney invokes the rule, it means nobody that's going to appear as a witness in that trial can sit in that courtroom and hear other people's testimony, nor can they talk about it with anybody else, nor can anybody else talk about it with him. So this attorney or this chief detective was under the rule. So he could give his testimony, but he couldn't discuss other people's testimony. He couldn't hear other people's testimony. Even after he was done testifying, when he could have sat and listened to the rest, he said, no, I just went back to work. That's what we did back then. You finish your testimony, you go back to work. So he was asked, how was the cross-examination by the defense? What was their focus? Because most of the time the defense in a criminal case is focused on how inadequate the police investigation was. You didn't do this and you failed to do that and blah, blah, blah. And he said, I didn't get that from the criminal defense attorney. It was, he clarified a few questions and that was it for cross-examination. So when he left the courtroom that day, he said, I felt very uneasy about what was going on in the courtroom because it didn't seem to him like the defense attorney had done any testing of their client to see if he was suffering from any impairment, such as autism. What's the reason for this flat affect? Didn't do anything like that. No one, not one single person, once someone, and he doesn't remember who, said shaken baby syndrome, everybody ran with it. They never looked in another direction. Never. I can tell you, this child, 2.5 years old, in her lifetime had been to the emergency room 40 times. 40. I don't know what for, but she was a very sickly child. She was born that way. She was born very sickly. And just a few days prior to this fall out of the crib, she had a 104-degree fever. She was taken to the emergency room by her father, treated and released on a medication now that you can't even prescribe for children. It's toxic. Like, they won't give that to kids anymore. But they gave it to this little girl, and then anyway. So this detective continued his testimony saying that they never looked beyond Robert Roberson. They never looked at any alternative theories. They never looked at anybody else. Once they were told shaken baby syndrome, this was what guided the remainder of their investigation. So there was no investigation into anything else that could possibly have happened to this child. So he was very uneasy over the years. He said there was no corroborating evidence that he had ever shaken that child. And he said it just felt very wrong to him, but he figured the appellate process would take care of this. And then when it didn't, he felt like he needed to come forward. He said that, the foundation of the case, which is shaken baby syndrome, is now considered what they're saying is junk science. And, the whole reason he was convicted no longer exists. So why are we putting this man to death? And he concluded his testimony by saying he was ashamed that he was so focused on finding the offender that he did not see the actual person. He said, I didn't see Robert. Now, this guy's I got the feeling now he's a pastor or he does ministers to people. He's gone to the prison several times and he has visited Robert. Trying to see what else he mentioned here. No other possibilities were explored. Here's another thing that's really interesting about this case. No one ever gave the hospital permission to turn off Nikki's life support. This father, who was the only one who could give that permission, never gave permission to turn off the life support. And this committee asked this detective, how many criminals do you know that bring their murder victim to the hospital for treatment? And he's like, I don't know of any. Yeah, capital criminals that just come to the hospital with their murder victim. No. So he said the criminal justice system absolutely got it wrong in this case. There was no murder committed, no crime committed, and this is an innocent man. And this is beyond question, he is an innocent man that we are going to put to death tonight. Then they had a doctor, Dr. Jeffrey Singer, who is a general surgeon, but he does a lot of work with, he's very intellectual. He was talking way above me. I had to really concentrate to understand a lot of what he was saying. But he was saying basically shaken baby syndrome is one of many medical blind spots out there. So with the advent of evidence-based medicine in 1990, because shaken baby syndrome actually was a hypothesis that came forward back in the 1970s. This man came up, they were seeing this triad, and he said, maybe it's from shaking. So we're going to call it shaken baby syndrome. And he really put it out there as a hypothesis to explain this triad. But it was never proven or disproven. It was just put into the medical school education, and everybody accepted it as, okay, you get this, you see this triad, that's what it is. Until evidence-based medicine came along, and they couldn't find any evidence to support the conclusion that anybody was shaking a baby that presented with this triad. Now what they're saying is it's not biomechanically possible for anybody to shake a baby hard enough that you would see these symptoms. But you will see these symptoms in the presence of infection, pneumonia, bleeding disorders. There's a host of other things, a whole host of other things. Those are just a few examples of what could be making these symptoms appear. So in the pediatric community now, they call it abusive head trauma. But when you see that triad, you have to see something additional in order to get that diagnosis of abusive head trauma, some additional trauma to go along with this triad, because there's so many other explanations for the triad. So if there's no additional trauma, you better start looking at other things. It's now a diagnosis of exclusion. Pediatricians have to rule out everything else. Police have to rule out everything else before they settle on this abusive head trauma diagnosis, which is a good thing. There have been in this country 34 people exonerated that were convicted based on shaken baby syndrome. Yet, somehow, Robert Roberson has slipped through the cracks over the years and has been denied a new trial and denied clemency yesterday. I don't know what's going to happen with this committee's recommendation that he appear before them next week and testify, since he's scheduled to die today. I don't know if the Supreme Court's going to step in, or the governor. I don't hold out any hope with Governor Abbott, because the man is clearly, He doesn't think like I do. We are on 2 different pages politically. He's not a person I would trust. I would never live in Texas. And I do choose where I live sometimes based on the politics that are going on in that state, which is why I left Florida. I would never live in Texas. I think Florida and Texas should just secede from the US and go off on their own little tangent. You could have Donald Trump as your president or Governor Abbott or Governor, who's the other bozo? The Florida guy. Anyway, I love you. If you're a Republican out there, I still love you. The election's almost over with. Don't worry about it. In any case, what this committee was looking at is there relevant scientific evidence that was not available at the time of this trial? Yes, there is now relevant evidence. There's evidence that this thing could be other things. It could have happened from her fall from the crib. She might have had an infection. She had this fever. It could have been from that drug she took. She could have had a bleeding disorder. I don't know. It could have been a lot of things that they didn't even explore during his trial. Or the law provides that is there evidence that would contradict the scientific evidence that was relied on at the time? So yes. So the answer to both these questions is yes. This is a law that was put into place in the state of Texas to help exonerate people that are wrongly convicted. So if you're following this law, this man should not be executed, is what this committee is saying. So how do we stop this execution that's supposed to happen in just a few hours? I do not know. One person said it's scientific sloppiness. Yeah, that there are long-held medical beliefs challenged by evidence-based medicine, and they kept referencing COVID. I don't know. I didn't get that reference. Maybe I'd have to do a little deeper dive to figure out what that reference was all about. I think I've told you everything I know. Choking can cause those symptoms if a child is choking. Yeah. So, yeah, shaking is unlikely. These were other witnesses that testified. Shaking is unlikely to cause these symptoms. They said the amount of force that you would need to shake this child to get those symptoms would break the child's neck. So, I'll let you know how this turns out tonight, 6:00. So leave me a comment. Let me know what you think of this case. If there's something I'm missing out there that would explain why this man is still sitting in a prison, why we're about to, while the state of Texas is about to execute a man that has a disability, and his conviction was based on scientific theory that's no longer, it's been debunked, and nothing else. So let me know your thoughts. Have a wonderful day. Sarah Boone is not starting today. I can tell you that. And the judge denied her snacks. So no snacks for Sarah Boone. I don't know if you watched my live yesterday, she had made a or tennis motion. Or tennis means when you don't have anything written down, you didn't write the motion and submit it to the clerk and give everybody copies. Or tennis means you just stood up in front of the judge and said, "Hey, judge, I need snacks." Well, the judge said no. She will get the same food that every other prisoner gets during their trials, which is peanut butter and jelly. So sorry, Sarah. Sarah's conviction is not going to be based on junk science. I can assure you, if you're put into a suitcase and you zip it up and suffocate, it's pretty clear you murdered somebody, okay? So, what remains to be seen is, did you have a good reason to do this? So I will see you in tomorrow. Hopefully there'll be some opening statements somewhere tomorrow. See you then. Take care, everybody. Bye.